Wealthy businessman laughed at his poor ex at a party, but DNA results of her triplet sons left him publicly shattered and speechless. Hi, my beautiful family. It's your Mr. Peter, and if it's your first time here, welcome home. You've just found a place where love lives in every word, and where you're never just a viewer. You're already family. Before we begin, let me offer a prayer, soft, healing, and full of love. May peace kiss the places in you that feel overwhelmed. May your fears soften, your breath deepen, your heart feel safe. May something gentle find you today, a kind word, a quiet moment, a feeling that reminds you, you are not broken, you are not alone, you are so deeply loved, more than you'll ever know. Now, my sweet family, I want to share something personal. For the past 2 days I've been quietly battling a strong migraine. It's exhausting and painful, and it's made everything harder. If you've ever been through this, please tell me what helped you. Your love, your prayers, your advice. I truly need it right now. Still, I'm here, writing with all my heart, even through the pain. So please, don't leave this story in the middle. Every word was crafted with love, for you. Stay with me. Feel it, let it speak to you, and one more small request from my heart. After the story ends, please rate it out of 10 in the comments. Be honest, be kind. Your words shape everything I create, and if you don't rate it, I'll quietly mind. Because I care deeply. Like this video, drop a kind comment, share it with someone who needs warmth today. Let the world feel what I feel every day, the beauty of this family, loyal, tender, and full of heart. Let's begin. With all my love, always.
Power, Steve Griggs had learned long ago, was the only currency that never depreciated. Crystal chandeliers scattered prismatic light across the marble floor of the Grand Regency Ballroom, where Silicon Valley's elite mingled like predators in designer clothing. Steve Griggs commanded the space from its center, a 32-year-old emperor whose smile had graced Forbes' Time and Fortune covers. His $800 million empire had risen from algorithms and ruthless ambition, from sleepless nights and calculated betrayals that transformed a middle-class dreamer into Silicon Valley royalty. Tonight's charity gala served as another stage for displaying dominance. The Griggs Foundation for Innovation, philanthropy masquerading as genuine charity, claimed to fund technology education for underprivileged students. In truth, the event existed solely to demonstrate Steve's influence, reminding every attendee that his reach extended into every corner of the tech ecosystem. He adjusted his custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo, the fabric worth more than most people's monthly salary, and accepted another glass of champagne from a server who moved through the crowd like a ghost. The bubbles tasted like victory, like every competitor he'd crushed and every dreamer he'd devoured to reach this pinnacle. Steve, darling. The voice belonged to Helena Blackston, a venture capitalist whose Botoxed face could no longer convey genuine emotion. She air-kissed him with the precision of a business transaction. This event is absolutely divine, though I must say some of the auction pieces are rather pedestrian. Steve's laugh was practiced, hollow. Not everyone appreciates genuine artistry, Helena. Some still believe emotional expression holds monetary value. The words escaped before he could stop them, sending something cold through his chest. Lately, he'd been thinking too much about art, paintings that spoke in colors instead of code, beauty that resisted quantification. He'd been contemplating things he'd sacrificed to build his golden fortress. Speaking of art, Helena's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. Isn't that your little charity case from years ago? The struggling artist? What was her name? Carla? Carmen? Steve's blood froze. Across the ballroom, past networking clusters and champagne towers, stood a figure he'd recognize anywhere, despite 3 years of deliberate forgetting. Carla Choi. Everything about her had changed except the fluid grace that once made his breath catch. Gone was the carefree artist who painted barefoot in her studio, dark skin glowing with creative passion. This woman wore elegant simplicity, a black dress that spoke of careful budgeting rather than casual expense. Her natural hair was pulled back, emphasizing the sharp beauty of her cheekbones. She looked older, weathered, like someone who'd learned to bear life's weight without complaint. Steve's chest tightened as memories crashed over him like a digital tsunami. Carla laughing as she splattered paint across his expensive shirt. Carla crying in his arms after her first gallery rejection. Carla whispering his name in the darkness of her tiny apartment while the city slept around them. Carla walking away from him 3 years ago, her spine straight and her pride intact after he'd chosen his reputation over their relationship. Well, well, Helena purred beside him. Looks like someone's trying to upgrade their social circle. Should we go say hello? I'm sure she'd love to reconnect with her former patron. The venom in Helena's voice snapped Steve back to the present. Around them, conversations had begun to still as people noticed Carla's presence. The tech elite had long memories and sharp tongues, and everyone remembered Steve's former association with the little artist girl who had dared to love above her station. Carla seemed oblivious to the attention, focused entirely on a particular painting in the auction display. Steve recognized it immediately. A piece by Miguel Santos, a local artist whose work dealt with themes of struggle and perseverance. The painting depicted a woman carrying 3 children through a storm, her face set with determination despite the chaos around her. It was priced at $15,000, far beyond what Steve remembered of Carla's financial means. As if sensing his gaze, Carla turned. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and for one heartbeat, Steve saw something vulnerable flicker in her expression. Then her mask slipped back into place, polite but distant, and she began walking toward him with the measured steps of someone approaching a necessary evil. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea, conversations dying as the tech elite smelled blood in the water. Steve felt his own mask sliding into place, the cold smile that had intimidated senators and CEOs, the expression that could freeze a boardroom or destroy a career with surgical precision. "Hello, Steve." Carla's voice was steady, professional. She stopped at what he recognized as a carefully calculated distance, close enough to show respect, far enough to maintain dignity. "Congratulations on another successful event." Carla. Her name felt foreign on his tongue, like a language he'd once been fluent in, but had forgotten through disuse. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." A murmur rippled through the surrounding crowd. Helena moved closer, her predatory instincts sharpened by the scent of potential drama. Other guests began forming a loose circle around them, phones discreetly positioned to capture whatever was about to unfold. "I came to bid on the Santos piece," Carla said, her chin lifting slightly. "I've been following his work, and I believe art should belong to people who understand its true value, not just those who can afford it." The subtle dig hit its mark, but Steve's expression didn't change. If anything, his smile grew colder. "How noble, though I have to wonder how someone in your situation plans to compete with serious collectors." "My situation?" Carla's voice remained level, but Steve caught the flash of fire in her dark eyes. "Let's be honest," Steve said, his voice carrying precisely far enough for the surrounding crowd. "We're hardly operating in the same financial universe. This is a charity auction, not a thrift store." Gasps rippled through the audience. Helena's smile turned predatory as phones lifted to capture each moment. Steve felt the familiar rush of dominance, the intoxicating power that came from reducing someone to their most vulnerable state before an audience. But Carla didn't crumble. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting. "You're absolutely right, Steve. We're not in the same universe. I actually work for what I have." The crowd held its collective breath. Steve's jaw tightened, his carefully constructed facade threatening to crack. How dare she challenge him here, in front of his peers, in the kingdom he'd built from nothing but code and ambition? "Work?" Steve's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Is that what you call it? I seem to remember your work consisting mainly of splashing paint on canvas and hoping someone would be charitable enough to call it art." "At least my work creates something beautiful," Carla replied, her voice still steady despite the tremor Steve could detect beneath the surface. "Your work just creates more efficient ways to steal from people who actually innovate." The accusation hit harder than Steve had expected. Around them, the crowd was absorbing every word, social media posts already being composed in real time. This would be trending within the hour, another piece of gossip for the tech world to dissect. Steve moved closer, invading Carla's personal space with predatory precision. "You want to talk about theft? Let me remind you of some facts. While you've been playing with finger paints, I've created technologies that touch billions of lives. I've built companies that employ thousands. I've generated wealth that funds research into diseases that kill children." His voice rose, each word calculated to inflict maximum damage. "So, forgive me if I don't consider your little hobby equivalent to actual achievement. The world doesn't need another struggling artist with delusions of grandeur. It needs people who can actually build something that matters." The silence that followed was deafening. Carla's face had gone pale, but her spine remained straight, her dignity intact, even as Steve's words carved into her like surgical instruments. Around them, the crowd watched with the morbid fascination of spectators at a gladiatorial combat. "You're absolutely right," Carla said finally, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying perfect clarity. "The world doesn't need another struggling artist. It needs people who remember what it means to be human." She turned to leave, then paused, looking back over her shoulder with something that might have been pity. "I'm sorry for whatever happened to you, Steve. You used to understand the difference between price and value." With that, she walked away, her head held high as she moved through the crowd that parted before her, like subjects before a queen in exile. Steve watched her go, his heart hammering against his ribs with something that felt dangerously close to regret. Helena materialized at his elbow, practically vibrating with excitement. Well, that was delicious. Nothing quite like watching people remember their place. But Steve barely heard her. He watched Carla's retreating figure, remembering the woman who'd once painted him in impossible colors, who'd found beauty in his code and poetry in his algorithms, the woman who'd loved him before he'd confused cruelty with strength. Conversations resumed with renewed energy, fueled by the spectacle they'd witnessed. Steve's phone buzzed with notifications, social media posts, news alerts, messages from publicists demanding damage control strategies. Yet all Steve could focus on was the look in Carla's eyes before she'd turned away. Not hatred or anger, but something far worse, pity. He drained his champagne and signaled for another, fighting the hollow sensation spreading through his chest. He'd won this confrontation, established dominance, reminded everyone of the natural hierarchy. So, why did victory taste like poison? The charity auction continued around him, bidders raising paddles for causes they'd forgotten by morning. But Steve's attention kept drifting to the Santos painting Carla had admired. The woman in the artwork carried her children through the storm with a strength that spoke of love rather than obligation, sacrifice rather than transaction. For the first time in years, Steve Griggs, master of the digital universe, king of Silicon Valley, destroyer of dreams, wondered if he'd built his golden cage so well that he'd forgotten how to find the door. Chapter 2. Shattered Pride. Dignity, Carla had discovered, was the one thing poverty couldn't steal. Only other people could do that. Autumn rain hammered against the cracked windows of Carla's third-floor apartment like accusations she couldn't escape. She sat at her easel in the corner that served as her studio, paintbrush suspended in midair as Steve's words echoed through her mind with relentless persistence. Whatever hovel you call home. The phrase had been calculated to wound, and it had found its mark with surgical precision. She surveyed the space she'd called home for 2 years. The apartment wasn't a hovel, though it bordered on one. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling like abstract art she hadn't chosen to create. The hardwood floors, once beautiful, bore scars from decades of neglectful landlords who viewed tenant turnover as profit margins. Still, it was clean, theirs, and most importantly, affordable on her 3-job income that barely qualified as employment. From the bedroom came whispered voices, her boys attempting not to wake her after what they assumed had been another grueling shift at the diner. Damien, Phoenix, and River. 8 years old and already more perceptive than most adults, they'd learned to read her moods like weather patterns, adjusting their behavior to accommodate the storms they sensed brewing in her heart. Carla set down her paintbrush and walked to their bedroom door, pushing it open just enough to see them huddled together on River's bed, homework spread between them like battle plans. They shared the same dark hair, the same intelligent eyes that seemed to hold depths far beyond their years. What broke her heart was how they'd learned to whisper, to make themselves small, to avoid drawing attention that might bring trouble to their precarious world. "Mom's home," Phoenix whispered, though he was looking at the door. He always knew when she was watching, some sixth sense that had developed from years of being her little guardian. "I know you're awake," Carla said softly, pushing the door open fully. "Homework time is over. Let's talk." They scrambled toward her with puppy-like enthusiasm, all 3 attempting to fit in her lap, despite having outgrown such arrangements. This was their nightly ritual, the emotional check-in where she monitored their well-being, and they monitored hers. "How was the fancy party, Mom?" Damien asked, his arms circling her neck. As the oldest by 3 minutes, he'd appointed himself family spokesman, taking the responsibility seriously. "Did you meet any princes?" River added, with the romantic idealism that set him apart from his pragmatic brothers. "Like in the fairy tales." "No princes," Carla said, smoothing his hair. "Just people with too much money and too little wisdom." Phoenix, ever the observer, studied her face with the intensity of a detective. "Someone was mean to you." It wasn't a question. At 8 years old, Phoenix could read people like Carla read brushstrokes, seeing layers of meaning that others missed entirely. She wondered sometimes if this was a survival skill they'd all developed from living so close to the edge, or if it was something inherited from their father, that ability to see through facades and identify weaknesses. Their father. The thought struck like it always did, unexpected and devastating. Even after 8 years, even after tonight's humiliation, Steve Griggs could still steal her breath. Not from lingering love. That emotion lay buried under layers of necessity and self-preservation, but because every glance at her sons revealed echoes of the man who'd promised her the world, then walked away when the price grew too steep. "Tell us," Damien said with the seriousness of a child who'd learned too early, that the world was full of people who hurt others. Carla considered deflecting with a comfortable lie, but her boys were too perceptive for such tactics, and she'd promised herself she would never underestimate their ability to handle truth. "I saw someone I used to know," she said carefully. "Someone who hurt me once, and tonight, he hurt me again." "Did he hit you?" River's voice was small, worried. They'd learned about bullying in school, and the concept terrified him. "No, sweetheart. He hurt me with words. Sometimes words can cut deeper than anything else." Phoenix shifted in her lap, his small hands finding hers. "What did he say?" Carla closed her eyes, remembering Steve's calculated cruelty, the satisfaction in his eyes as he'd watched her composure crack. He said that what I do, my art, my work, doesn't matter. He said I was foolish for thinking I could create something beautiful. The silence that followed was profound. Her boys exchanged looks that spoke of communications beyond her understanding, some form of triplet telepathy that had developed between them before they could even speak. Then Damien stood up, walking to the corner where she kept her easel. "This matters," he said, pointing to her latest painting, a piece she'd been working on for months that depicted 3 children building a castle from broken pieces of glass, their faces bright with determination despite the chaos around them. "This is beautiful. This makes me feel things," Phoenix added, joining his brother. "When I look at it, I understand that broken things can still be magical." River, always the poet of the group, stayed in her lap but took her face in his small hands. "Mom, that man doesn't know about us. He doesn't know you wake up at 4 in the morning to paint before your first job. He doesn't know you draw pictures on our lunch bags to make us smile. He doesn't know you cry sometimes when you think we're asleep because you're scared we won't have enough." Carla's breath caught. River ... "We do have enough," he continued with the fierce certainty of childhood. "We have each other. We have your art. We have love. That man sounds poor to me." The tears came then, hot and cleansing, washing away the last residue of Steve's cruelty. Her boys surrounded her, their small arms strong and sure, their love unconditional in a way that still surprised her after 8 years of their devotion. "I'm sorry," she whispered into their hair. "I'm sorry you have to see me like this. I'm sorry I can't give you everything you deserve." "Mom," Damien said with the patience of someone far older than his years, "you give us everything we need, and someday when we're grown up, we're going to make sure you never have to worry about money again." "We're going to be successful," Phoenix added, "but not like that mean man. We're going to be successful and still remember how to be kind." "We're going to take care of you," River said simply, "because that's what families do." Later, after they'd fallen asleep in her bed, another violation of the rules she'd tried to establish but couldn't bear to enforce, Carla sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea and a calculator, trying to make numbers work that had never been friendly to her. The math was unforgiving. 3 jobs, 60 hours a week, and still barely enough to cover rent, utilities, food, and the boys' school supplies. The Santos painting she'd admired at the auction would have sold by now, probably to some collector who would hang it in a climate-controlled room and see it as an investment rather than a window into the human experience. She'd wanted it not for herself but for the boys, had imagined hanging it in their bedroom where they could see that strength came in many forms. $15,000. The number was laughable, impossible, a sum that existed in a universe parallel to hers. Steve had been right about one thing. They weren't operating in the same financial stratosphere. He commanded millions with the casual authority of someone discussing the weather, while she calculated whether they could afford name-brand cereal this week. But sitting there in her kitchen, surrounded by her son's artwork taped to the refrigerator and their school photos magneted to every available surface, Carla felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Pride. Not the brittle pride that came from pretending her situation was better than it was, but genuine pride in what she'd built from nothing. She'd raised 3 extraordinary human beings who understood empathy, who valued creativity, who measured wealth in love rather than dollars. She'd maintained her artistic vision despite working jobs that left her exhausted and discouraged. She'd kept her family together through sheer force of will and careful budgeting, and the kind of love that transformed water into wine. Steve could keep his $800 million, his custom suits, his marble floors, and crystal chandeliers. He could keep his world where people were measured by their net worth, and success was calculated in quarterly reports. He'd made his choice 3 years ago when he'd walked away from what they could have built together, and tonight he'd reminded her exactly why she'd let him go. Her phone buzzed with a text message, probably from Yuki, her friend who worked the night shift at the hospital and often checked in during her breaks. But when she looked at the screen, her blood turned to ice. "I saw the video. Are you okay?" M-Star video. Of course, someone had posted the confrontation online. By now, it would be making the rounds of social media, accompanied by commentary from people who saw her humiliation as entertainment. She could already imagine the headlines: "Tech mogul destroys ex at charity event," or "When gold diggers attack, Steve Griggs shows class." Carla deleted the message without responding and turned off her phone. Whatever was being said about her online, whatever narrative was being constructed from 30 seconds of edited footage, it didn't matter. The only opinions that counted were sleeping in her bedroom, secure in the knowledge that they were loved beyond measure. She walked to her easel and picked up her paintbrush, loading it with deep blues and purples, colors of resilience, of depth, of strength forged through surviving storms rather than causing them. The blank canvas held infinite possibility, waiting for her to transform it into something beautiful. Outside, rain continued falling, but inside her small apartment, surrounded by evidence of love and creativity, Carla Choi began to paint. Not because she had to, not because anyone was paying her, but because art was her language for making sense of a senseless world. In that moment, with paint-stained fingers and a heart slowly healing from fresh wounds, she possessed wealth that Steve Griggs would never understand. Chapter 3. Ghosts in Glass Towers. Some secrets are buried so deep they become the foundation upon which empires rise, until someone digs too far. Griggs Tower pierced the San Francisco skyline like a steel and glass monument to ambition, its 47 floors housing the technological empire Steve had built from code and calculated risks. At 3 in the morning, the building stood mostly empty, its corridors bathed in the ambient glow of server farms and punctuated by security guards making their rounds. During these quiet hours, the tower revealed its true nature, not as a shrine to innovation, but as a mausoleum for dreams that had been systematically acquired, dissected, and repurposed. Carla pushed her cleaning cart down the marble corridors of the 38th floor, movements efficient and nearly silent. The burgundy Pinnacle Cleaning Services uniform hung loose on her frame, designed for invisibility rather than comfort. A baseball cap pulled low ensured security cameras captured nothing more than a generic service worker performing routine maintenance, exactly her intention. She'd held this position for 6 months, ever since the diner cut her hours and the art supply store eliminated her position during restructuring. The irony wasn't lost on her. She now cleaned offices belonging to the man who'd publicly humiliated her 2 weeks prior. But irony didn't pay rent, and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford with 3 growing boys to feed. The work was routine: empty trash bins, dust surfaces, vacuum carpets, sanitized bathrooms. Executive floors required additional security clearance. Carla's supervisor had provided her with temporary access codes for quarterly deep cleaning contracts. Tonight was one of those scheduled maintenance nights when cleaning crews were authorized for all floors, including executive areas normally off-limits. She'd reached the executive floor when she noticed light emanating from the corner office. Steve's office. According to the schedule, all executives should have vacated by 10 p.m. for the cleaning cycle. Her hands tightened on the cart handle, but protocol demanded she clean every scheduled area. The office door stood ajar, a security violation that should have triggered automatic lockdown. Through the gap, she glimpsed papers scattered across the massive desk and multiple monitors still active. But the bulletin board on the far wall drew her attention, covered with documents that seemed oddly familiar. The office door stood ajar. Through the gap, she glimpsed papers scattered across the massive desk and multiple monitors displaying code that meant nothing to her untrained eye. But the bulletin board on the far wall drew her attention, covered with photographs and documents that seemed oddly familiar. Carla hesitated. The smart thing would be to clean around the office and return when it was properly empty. But something about those papers called to her, some instinct honed by years of surviving in a world that rarely offered second chances. She pushed the door open just wide enough to slip inside, leaving her cart in the hallway. The office was a shrine to success, every surface carefully curated to project power and achievement. Awards lined the walls, photographs showed Steve shaking hands with presidents and tech luminaries, and the view through the floor-to-ceiling windows commanded the entire Bay Area like a conquered territory. But it was the bulletin board that held her attention, covered with what looked like invention patents, technical diagrams, and newspaper clippings. She moved closer, her heart beginning to race as she recognized some of the names on the documents. Marcus Chen, whose revolutionary battery technology had been acquired by Griggs Industries 3 years ago, only for Marcus to disappear from the tech scene entirely. Elena Rodriguez, whose AI algorithm had somehow become the foundation for Steve's most profitable product line, despite Elena never being credited as anything more than a consultant. David Kim, whose neural interface prototype had been the breakthrough that had launched Steve's company into the stratosphere of tech giants. Carla's hands trembled as she realized what she was looking at, a meticulous record of intellectual property theft spanning nearly a decade. Each document told the same story. Brilliant inventors approached by Griggs Industries with promises of partnerships and funding, only to have their life's work absorbed into Steve's empire while they were left with non-disclosure agreements and non-compete clauses that effectively ended their careers. The sound of elevator doors opening sent adrenaline flooding her system. Carla quickly photographed as many documents as possible in her remaining time. Patent applications, email correspondence, legal documents outlining the systematic acquisition of others' innovations, evidence of a business model built on theft disguised as legitimate investment. She'd captured nearly 24 documents when footsteps approached down the corridor. Panic overtook her as she realized she'd been so focused on evidence gathering that she'd lost track of time. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a voice that froze her blood. Need those projections Monday morning, and I want legal reviewing the Hendricks acquisition before we proceed. These small inventors always think they're cleverer than they actually are. Steve's voice carried casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences. Carla looked desperately for an escape route, but the office had only one entrance, and Steve was already in the corridor. She could hear him thanking someone, probably a driver, and dismissing them for the night. Desperate, she ducked behind the massive desk, praying shadows would conceal her if he didn't activate all the lights. Her heart hammered so loudly she feared it would betray her location, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, to become as small and invisible as possible. Steve entered the office with the confident stride of someone in complete control of his environment. Carla could see his expensive Italian leather shoes from her hiding place, could smell the subtle cologne that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He moved to the windows first, standing silhouetted against the city lights as he made what sounded like a late-night phone call. "The Nakamura deal needs to be accelerated," he said into his phone, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing the weather rather than another person's livelihood. "I want his lab cleared out by Friday. Yes, I understand he's resistant, but that's what the non-disclosure agreements are for. He took our money, which means his research belongs to us now." Carla felt sick listening to Steve orchestrate what was clearly another theft, another brilliant mind being systematically destroyed by corporate machinery designed to transfer innovation from creators to consumers without fair compensation. She thought about her own struggles, her 3 jobs, her constant worry about providing for her boys, and felt a surge of anger so pure it threatened to make her reckless. Steve ended his call and moved to his desk, settling into the executive chair directly above where Carla crouched in terror. She could hear him typing, probably sending emails that would ruin lives with the casual efficiency of someone ordering coffee. For 20 minutes, she remained frozen in place, every muscle in her body screaming in protest, while Steve worked mere feet above her head. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She, who had once been intimate enough with this man to know his breathing patterns, was now hiding from him like a criminal in his own office. The Steve she'd known years ago had been driven, certainly, and ambitious to a fault, but there had been something almost idealistic about his vision for technology. This man typing above her head was someone different entirely, someone who had sacrificed every principle in pursuit of a success that seemed to hollow him out rather than fulfill him. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably less than 30 minutes, Steve stood up and moved toward the door. Carla heard him turning off lights, the soft sound of the door closing, and then the blessed silence that meant she was alone again. She waited another 10 minutes before emerging from her hiding place, her legs shaking from both fear and the cramped position she'd maintained. The documents were still there, still spread across the bulletin board like a museum exhibition of corporate malfeasance. She took a few more photographs, making sure to capture the details that clearly showed the systematic nature of Steve's theft. As she prepared to leave, her eyes fell on a framed photograph tucked into the corner of the bulletin board, a picture that made her blood run cold. It was her from years ago, laughing at something off-camera while she painted in her old studio. She was wearing one of Steve's shirts, her hair caught in golden sunlight streaming through the windows, her face radiant with the kind of happiness that seemed impossible now. The photograph was candid, intimate, the kind of picture someone took when they were in love with their subject. But seeing it displayed here among the evidence of Steve's systematic destruction of other people's dreams felt like a violation. It was as if he'd kept her image as a trophy, a reminder of another conquest, another person whose life he'd fundamentally altered for his own benefit. Carla carefully photographed the picture of herself, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps as evidence of how completely Steve had compartmentalized his life, how he could display reminders of love in the same space where he planned the destruction of innocent people's careers. She slipped out of the office as quietly as she'd entered, retrieving her cleaning cart and continuing her rounds as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The evidence on her phone represented not just Steve's crimes, but potentially the power to bring justice to all the inventors he'd systematically destroyed. For the first time in years, Carla felt like she held cards in a game she'd thought she could never win. The question now was whether she had the courage to play them, knowing that Steve Griggs had spent a decade perfecting the art of destroying anyone who threatened his empire. As she finished her shift and prepared to leave the building, Carla made a decision that would change everything. She would find a way to contact Steve's victims, to show them they weren't alone in their suffering. She would build a case so airtight that even Steve's army of lawyers couldn't dismiss it. But first, she had to get home to her boys, to the small apartment that suddenly felt like a fortress against the corruption that filled these glass towers. The evidence burning on her phone represented hope, dangerous, complicated hope, but hope nonetheless. Steve Griggs had built his empire on stolen dreams. It was time for the dreamers to take back what belonged to them. Chapter 4. The Art of Survival. True genius, Carla understood, wasn't in knowing all the answers. It was in asking questions that changed everything. Morning light filtering through Beacon Elementary School's grimy windows cast geometric patterns across the conference table where Carla sat, struggling to process what she'd just heard. Across from her, Mrs. Helena Voss, the school's gifted and talented coordinator, spread test results and portfolio samples like evidence in a trial that would determine her son's futures. "Mrs. Choi, I'll be direct," Mrs. Voss said, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades spent identifying exceptional children in a system designed for mediocrity. In 30 years of education, I've never encountered anything quite like your sons. Their cognitive abilities are extraordinary. Carla gripped her coffee cup, bitter institutional brew that tasted like necessity rather than comfort. She'd used her lunch break from the diner to attend this meeting, her uniform still redolent with grease and other people's conversations. What exactly are you saying? Mrs. Voss lifted a paper covered in numbers that meant nothing to Carla but everything to educational bureaucracy. Damien scored in the 99th.8 percentiles on spatial reasoning and logical analysis. His understanding of complex systems rivals children twice his age. But it's not just raw intelligence. He thinks strategically, seeing patterns most adults miss. She shifted to another document. Phoenix demonstrates exceptional emotional intelligence combined with analytical processing. He reads people like textbooks, understanding motivations and predicting behaviors with uncanny accuracy, plus remarkable aptitude for technology and systems thinking. The third paper felt heavier. River is perhaps the most unusual. His creative intelligence scores exceed our charts, combined with mathematical genius. He sees the world in equations and poetry simultaneously. Yesterday, he solved a calculus problem I use for high school students, then wrote a haiku about the solution that moved me to tears. Carla felt the familiar sensation of the world tilting slightly off its axis. She'd known her boys were special, any mother would, but hearing it quantified, measured, and validated by someone whose job was to identify exceptional children made it real in a way that terrified her. What does this mean for them? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer would be complicated. It means they need resources we can't provide here, Mrs. Voss said gently. Damien should be in advanced mathematics and science programs. Phoenix needs access to technology and social psychology curricula. River requires both advanced mathematics and creative arts programs that can challenge his unique dual nature. The unspoken reality hung between them. These resources cost money Carla didn't have, required connections she'd never formed, demanded sacrifices she wasn't sure she could make. The boys' exceptional abilities were both a gift and a burden, opening doors to futures that seemed impossibly distant from their current reality. There are programs, Mrs. Voss continued, scholarships, opportunities for gifted children from disadvantaged backgrounds, but the application processes are competitive, complex, and time-consuming. Carla nodded, already calculating the hours she'd need to steal from sleep to research these opportunities, the complexity of managing applications while working 3 jobs. Send me the information, I'll figure it out. Mrs. Voss smiled, the first genuine warmth Carla had seen from her. I had a feeling you'd say that. Mrs. Choi, may I ask what you do for work? I'm a waitress at Murphy's Diner. I clean office buildings at night, and I work weekends at an art supply store. Carla didn't mention the 4th job that wasn't really a job, her art, which she'd been pursuing with renewed passion, despite having no logical reason to believe it would ever amount to anything. You're an artist? I try to be. It doesn't pay the bills, but... Carla shrugged, not sure how to explain that art was less career choice than biological necessity, like breathing or bleeding. Mrs. Voss leaned forward, suddenly more interested. Have you considered that your son's exceptional abilities might be inherited? Artistic creativity and intellectual giftedness often run in families. Before Carla could respond, her phone buzzed with a message that stopped her heart. The text came from an unknown number. Your painting, Resilience in Blue, sold for $8,000. Payment processing tonight. Thank you for your stunning work. Gallery Underground. Carla stared at the screen, reading the words 3 times before they penetrated. $8,000. For a painting she'd created during sleepless nights at her kitchen table, working by lamplight while her boys slept. A painting she'd submitted to Gallery Underground, expecting nothing more than polite rejection. "Mrs. Choi, are you all right?" "I dot." Carla showed Mrs. Voss the message, still unable to process its implications. "I just sold a painting." Mrs. Voss read the message and whistled low. $8,000. That's substantial money for an emerging artist. Substantial money for anyone, Carla thought. $8,000 meant rent for 4 months, school supplies and clothes for the boys, a buffer that might allow her to take risks she'd never been able to consider. That afternoon, after picking up the boys from school, Carla found herself in Gallery Underground's converted warehouse space, staring at the wall where her painting had hung that morning. Ruth Castellanos, the gallery owner with silver hair and perceptive eyes, explained that a private collector had purchased the piece within hours of installation. "The buyer wants to remain anonymous," Ruth said, "but they're interested in commissioning additional work. They want to acquire anything you create. That's unusual for someone at your career stage." Carla walked through the gallery, seeing her work displayed alongside established artists. The pieces looked different here, professionally framed and lit, transformed from personal expression into something strangers valued enough to purchase. "Mom, look." River's voice drew her attention to where her boys stood before a painting she'd titled Mathematics of Love, geometric patterns exploring how people connect and separate and find each other again. "It's like a secret code," Phoenix said, studying the intersecting lines intently. Damien was photographing each painting with Carla's phone. "Mom, you should make more. People will pay you to create beauty. That's actually the best job in the world." Ruth overheard him and laughed. "Your son has excellent taste. Mrs. Choi, I'd like to propose something. What if we scheduled a solo exhibition for 6 months from now? Give you time to create a cohesive body of work, build some buzz in the art community." A solo exhibition. Carla had dreamed of such an opportunity for years, but it had always seemed as distant as space travel. Now, watching her boys explore the gallery with the enthusiasm of explorers discovering new continents, it felt suddenly, impossibly within reach. "I work 3 jobs, Carla said, as if Ruth might not have noticed her exhaustion or the way her hands showed the signs of manual labor. "I don't know if I can produce enough work in 6 months." "The mysterious buyer asked me to give you this," Ruth said, handing Carla an envelope. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a note written in elegant handwriting, "For time to create without worry. Art matters. Your vision matters. The world needs what you see." Carla's legs gave out and she found herself sitting heavily in one of the gallery's chairs. $50,000 was more money than she'd seen in one place in her entire life. It was freedom from the diner, from cleaning offices at night, from the constant calculation of whether they could afford name-brand cereal. "Mom?" Damien's voice was worried. "Are you okay?" Carla looked at her sons, at Ruth, at the gallery full of art that proved beauty could survive in a world that often seemed designed to crush it. "I'm great, baby. We're all great." That evening, after the boys had fallen asleep in excited exhaustion from their gallery adventure, Carla sat at her easel with a blank canvas and a heart full of possibilities. The check sat on her kitchen table like a promise, like proof that somewhere in the world someone believed her art mattered enough to invest in its creation. She loaded her brush with deep gold paint, the color of hope, of sunrise after the longest night, and made the first mark on the canvas. As she painted, she thought about Mrs. Voss's words, about inherited abilities, about the way her boys saw the world in patterns and connections that others missed. Maybe they'd gotten their gifts from their father, the intelligence, the strategic thinking, the ability to see systems and exploit them. But the creativity, the empathy, The understanding that beauty was worth creating even when no one was paying attention, that came from surviving together, from building something meaningful from whatever materials life provided. The mysterious benefactor who'd bought her paintings and provided this incredible opportunity remained nameless, but Carla found herself grateful beyond words. Someone, somewhere, understood that art wasn't luxury but necessity, that creativity was what separated survival from living. As she painted through the night, creating something beautiful from pigment and passion, Carla felt the future shifting around them like tectonic plates finding new alignment. Her boys would have opportunities now, chances to develop their exceptional abilities. She would have time to create without the constant pressure of immediate financial need. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she wondered if Steve Griggs would see the news of her success, would understand that the woman he'd called delusional had been right all along. The world did need art, did value beauty, did recognize that some things couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports. But that was his loss to consider. Carla had more important things to focus on. Three extraordinary boys who needed her to show them that talent combined with determination could transform everything, and a canvas waiting to be filled with colors that didn't exist until she mixed them into being. Chapter 5. Cracks in the Foundation. Power built on stolen foundations inevitably crumbles. The only question is whether the architect survives the collapse. Steve Griggs stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching San Francisco fog roll across the bay like an invading army. Below, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm of ambition and desperation, but something fundamental had shifted in recent weeks. The empire he'd built from code and calculated acquisitions was under siege, and for the first time in his career, Steve wasn't certain he could emerge victorious. The conference table behind him was littered with legal documents, each representing another crack in Griggs Industries' foundation. Patent disputes, intellectual property lawsuits, whistleblower complaints, and SEC investigations had multiplied like a virus in his corporate bloodstream. What had started as isolated incidents, a disgruntled contractor here, a patent challenge there, had evolved into coordinated assault, suggesting someone with intimate knowledge was orchestrating the attacks. "Sir," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom with nervous energy of someone delivering bad news to a besieged king. "The legal team is ready for the morning briefing." Steve turned from the window, straightening his tie with movements that had become mechanical rather than confident. "Send them in." The legal team entered like mourners at a funeral, their expensive suits and grim expressions creating an atmosphere of barely controlled panic. Leading the group was Janet Morrison, Griggs Industries' chief legal counsel, whose reputation for aggressive corporate defense had cost Steve more in the past year than most people earned in a lifetime. "How bad is it?" Steve asked without preamble, settling into his chair with the exhaustion of someone fighting a multi-front war. Janet opened her tablet, scrolling through what looked like an endless catalog of legal catastrophes. The Hendricks suit gained 3 plaintiffs overnight. Other inventors have come forward claiming similar theft patterns. The Kim case achieved class action status, which means— "I understand the implications," Steve interrupted. "How many total plaintiffs?" 47 as of this morning. But Steve, that's not the worst part. Janet's voice carried the tone of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. Someone's been providing these plaintiffs with internal documents, emails, patent applications, acquisition records, information that should have been confidential. Steve's blood turned to ice water. What kind of internal documents? The kind that prove systematic intellectual property theft dating back 9 years, said Marcus Webb, the firm's senior partner, whose presence at this meeting indicated just how serious the situation had become. Someone with access to your personal files has been systematically leaking evidence that corroborates every claim being made against the company. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Steve felt the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to contract, the oxygen becoming thinner with each revelation. Someone inside his organization, someone with extraordinary access, was dismantling his empire with surgical precision. "Have we identified the leak?" Steve's voice was dangerously quiet, the tone that had intimidated senators and CEOs. "We're working on it," Janet said. "But Steve, we need to discuss settlement options. If these cases go to trial with the evidence they apparently have." "No settlements." Steve's fist hit the table with enough force to make everyone jump. "I didn't build this company to watch it be destroyed by a handful of failed inventors who couldn't monetize their own ideas." Marcus cleared his throat, the sound carrying decades of legal experience. "Steve, with respect, this isn't about failed inventors anymore. This is about systematic corporate fraud. If the plaintiffs can prove you deliberately stole intellectual property with the intent to defraud, then what?" Steve stood up, pacing to the window again. "Then I lose everything I've built. Then 40,000 employees lose their jobs. Then pension funds and retirement accounts tied to our stock prices collapse. You think these plaintiffs have considered that?" The legal team exchanged glances that spoke of conversations Steve wasn't privy to, strategic discussions that had taken place without his involvement. Janet leaned forward, her voice gentler than Steve had ever heard it. "Steve, there's something else. The FBI has opened a preliminary investigation into corporate fraud allegations. This isn't just civil litigation anymore. Criminal charges are a real possibility." The words hit Steve like a physical blow. Criminal charges, prison, the destruction not just of his company, but of his freedom, his future, everything he'd sacrificed to build. He thought about his father, who'd worked construction for 40 years and died without ever seeing his son's success. He thought about the promise he'd made to himself at his father's funeral, that he would build something permanent, something that would outlast flesh and bone. "How long do we have?" Steve asked. "The preliminary investigation could last months, or it could accelerate quickly if they find compelling evidence," Marcus said. "But Steve, you need to understand, if someone inside your organization is feeding information to federal investigators." Steve's phone buzzed with a news alert that made his stomach drop. The headline read, "Tech mogul's empire built on stolen dreams. Former employees speak out." The article, published in TechCrunch, featured interviews with 7 former Griggs Industries employees who described a corporate culture that rewarded theft and punished ethical concerns. But it was the final paragraph that made Steve's world tilt on its axis. Sources close to the investigation suggest that evidence of systematic intellectual property theft has been compiled by someone with intimate knowledge of Griggs Industries' acquisition practices. This anonymous whistleblower has reportedly provided federal investigators with documentation spanning nearly a decade of alleged corporate fraud. Anonymous whistleblower. Someone who knew his business practices intimately. Someone who had access to records dating back 9 years. Steve felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with the horrible clarity of a nightmare becoming real. "I need the office swept for bugs," he said suddenly. "I want our security team to audit everyone with access to executive-level documents. I want to know who's been in my office, who's touched my files, who's had access to information they shouldn't have." Steve nodded, making notes. "Of course. But Steve, we also need to discuss immediate strategy. Your reputation—" "My reputation is irrelevant right now," Steve said, though the words tasted bitter. His reputation was the legacy that would outlast quarterly reports and stock prices. "I want to know who has access to my private files." As the legal team departed, Steve remained alone with thoughts that had circled his mind like vultures for weeks. The timing of these attacks wasn't coincidental. The legal strategy's sophistication suggested someone with intimate knowledge not just of his business practices, but of his psychological vulnerabilities. Someone who knew exactly where to strike for maximum damage. Someone with personal reason to hate him. Steve's mind drifted, as it had been doing with increasing frequency, to Carla Choi. 2 weeks had passed since their confrontation at the charity gala, but he couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd looked at him, not with expected fear or anger, but with something that might have been pity. The look of someone who had once loved him and now mourned what he'd become. He'd been obsessing over her in ways that made no logical sense. Late at night, when sleep eluded him, he found himself researching her life with the thoroughness he usually reserved for potential acquisitions. He discovered that she worked multiple jobs, that she was raising 3 sons alone, that she'd somehow maintained her artistic vision despite circumstances that would have crushed most people's dreams. The thought of her children sent an unexpected pang through his chest. 3 boys, 8 years old, whose ages aligned with the period when he and Carla had been involved. The mathematics was simple, but the implications were too complex and terrifying to consider seriously. Steve pulled up Carla's social media profiles on his computer, scrolling through carefully curated glimpses of a life he'd never been part of. Pictures of her boys at school events, in playgrounds, working on art projects at kitchen tables. They were beautiful children, intelligent-looking, with eyes that seemed too knowing for their ages. One photograph stopped him cold. It showed the 3 boys working together on what appeared to be a complex mathematics problem, their faces intense with concentration. But it was their resemblance to each other and to someone else that made Steve's breath catch. The shape of their faces, the intelligence in their eyes, the way they held themselves with unconscious confidence. They looked like his brothers. They looked like him. The realization hit Steve with the force of a revelation and the terror of a diagnosis. If those children were his, if Carla had been pregnant when she disappeared from his life 3 years ago, then everything changed. The timeline fit. The circumstances aligned. The reason for her sudden departure, for her refusal to accept his money, for the cold dignity with which she'd faced his cruelty at the gala. Steve's hands shook as he closed the browser, unable to process the implications of what he suspected. If those boys were his sons, then he'd not only lost the woman he'd loved, but also 3 children he'd never known existed. If they were his sons, then his empire, built on stolen dreams and calculated cruelty, was the inheritance he was leaving them. The phone rang, jarring him from his spiraling thoughts. Janet's voice was tight with new panic. "Steve, we have a problem. Someone just released internal emails between you and the acquisition team about the Chen battery technology. They're detailed, they're damning, and they're all over social media." Steve closed his eyes, feeling the walls of his golden cage contracting around him. Somewhere out there, someone who knew his secrets was systematically destroying everything he'd built. And somewhere else, a woman he'd never stopped loving was raising 3 children who might be the most important people in his life. Children he'd lost before he'd even known they existed. For the first time since building his empire, Steve Griggs felt genuinely afraid. Not of losing money or reputation, but of losing something far more precious, the chance to be the man he should have been all along. Chapter 6. The Mysterious Benefactor. Love, Steve discovered, was the only force that could make a brilliant man act like a complete fool while convincing himself he was being logical. The nightmare always began identically. Steve standing in his office watching his empire crumble through floor-to-ceiling windows that suddenly became prison bars. Children's laughter echoed from somewhere unreachable, growing fainter until silence consumed everything. He would wake gasping, silk sheets soaked with sweat, phantom voices lingering like accusations. This morning was no different, except Steve didn't immediately reach for his phone to check overnight market reports or scan for new legal disasters. Instead, he lay in his king-sized bed, custom-made, worth more than most people's cars, utterly empty, staring at the ceiling as realization crashed over him like a tide he'd been holding back for months. He was in love with Carla Choi. Still, after 3 years of trying to forget her, after building walls of success and cruelty designed to protect him from vulnerability, after publicly humiliating her before people whose opinions meant nothing, he was still desperately, pathetically, completely in love with the woman he'd lost through his own cowardice. But that wasn't the revelation that made his hands shake as he reached for coffee his housekeeper had left on the nightstand. The truth, lurking in his subconscious, carefully hidden from rational thought, was far more complex and terrifying. Steve grabbed his laptop, typing with the urgency of someone solving a puzzle that had been driving him slowly insane. Account records, financial transactions, art acquisition receipts, digital breadcrumbs that would either confirm his suspicion or prove he was losing his mind. The evidence was there, laid out across multiple screens like fragments of a confession he'd been writing unconsciously. For 3 years, Stephen Griggs had been systematically purchasing Carla Choi's artwork through intermediary galleries, shell companies, and anonymous bidding services. 67 pieces in total, worth nearly $200,000, acquired through such complex financial misdirection that even his accountants probably couldn't trace the purchases back to him. Resilience in Blue, the painting that had sold for $8,000 just weeks ago, had been bought by Meridian Investment Holdings, a subsidiary of one of Steve's personal portfolio companies. The recent $50,000 commission that had apparently freed Carla from her multiple jobs had come from Apex Cultural Acquisitions, another entity so deeply buried in Steve's financial empire that it would take forensic accountants months to connect it to him. Steve stared at the transaction records, seeing his own obsession documented in numbers and dates that painted a picture of a man unable to let go of something he'd convinced himself he didn't want. Every time one of Carla's pieces appeared in a gallery, every time she participated in a group exhibition, somehow his money found its way to her bank account. He'd been unconsciously supporting her art for 3 years, while consciously telling himself he'd moved on. The apartment that served as his primary residence in the city suddenly felt different as Steve walked through it with new awareness. The walls he'd thought were decorated with carefully curated pieces by established artists were actually a shrine to Carla's evolution as an artist. Her paintings covered every room, tracking her growth from the tentative early works that showed promise to the masterful recent pieces that had gallery owners calling her the most important new voice in contemporary art. He stopped before Mathematics of Love, the piece his assistant had bid on at Gallery Underground just 2 months ago. Steve had told himself he was interested in the painting's innovative use of geometric patterns to explore human connection. The truth was simpler and more devastating. He'd seen Carla's signature in the corner and couldn't bear to let someone else own something she'd created. The painting showed intersecting lines and curves that formed complex patterns, suggesting faces, bodies, moments of intimacy and separation. Looking at it now, Steve could see the story Carla was telling, how people found each other, lost each other, and sometimes, if they were very lucky, found their way back. It was a hopeful piece, full of possibility and second chances. Everything I touch turns to gold except the things that actually matter. The thought arrived unbidden, carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of suppressed self-awareness. Steve had built an empire worth $800 million, but he'd been secretly funding the art career of a woman he'd publicly humiliated because some part of him, some part he'd been unwilling to acknowledge, knew that her creativity was worth more than all his acquisitions combined. His phone buzzed with a call from his private investigator, a man Steve had hired to conduct background research on various business contacts. In reality, Marcus Hendricks specialized in finding information that people preferred to keep private, and Steve had been using his services to learn everything possible about Carla's current life. Mr. Griggs, Marcus's voice carried professional neutrality of someone who'd learned not to judge clients' motivations. I have the information you requested about Ms. Choi's children. Steve's mouth went dry. What did you find? The birth records show triplets born 8 years ago at San Francisco General Hospital. Damien, Phoenix, and River Choi. No father listed on the birth certificates, and no record of paternity tests or child support arrangements. The timeline hit Steve like a physical blow. 8 years ago, he'd been deeply involved with Carla. They'd been planning a future together, talking about moving in together, making commitments that had terrified him into sabotaging their relationship through his engagement to someone else. If she'd been pregnant when she disappeared from his life. Mr. Griggs, are you there? What else? Steve's voice was barely a whisper. The boys are exceptional students, all 3 tested into the gifted program at their school. Teachers describe them as unusually intelligent and mature. Ms. Choi has been raising them alone while working multiple jobs, though recently she seems to have achieved financial stability through her art sales. Art sales that Steve had been funding through his unconscious obsession with staying connected to the woman he'd lost. The irony would have been amusing if it wasn't so tragic. He'd been anonymously supporting the family he'd never known existed, while publicly denying any connection to them. I need DNA evidence, Steve said suddenly. Sir, hair samples, discarded items, anything that could provide genetic material for testing. I need to know. Steve's voice caught. I need to know if those children are mine. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Steve to wonder if the connection had been lost. Finally, Marcus spoke with the careful tone of someone navigating dangerous territory. Mr. Griggs, that would require illegal surveillance and theft of genetic material from minors. I can't assist with that kind of operation. Then find me someone who can, Steve said, then immediately hated himself for the words. This wasn't who he wanted to be, a man who violated the privacy of children to satisfy his own need for answers. But the possibility that he had 3 sons he'd never known about was driving him toward actions that his rational mind knew were wrong. After ending the call, Steve sat in his living room surrounded by Carla's artwork, trying to process the magnitude of what he might have lost. If those boys were his children, then his empire, built on stolen dreams and corporate manipulation, was the inheritance he was leaving them. The business practices that were currently destroying his reputation would become their legacy. But more than that, if those children were his, then he'd spent 3 years building walls to protect himself from a vulnerability that had already claimed him completely. He'd been a father without knowing it, supporting his own children through anonymous art purchases, while convincing himself he'd moved on from their mother. Steve's laptop chimed with another news alert about his company's legal troubles. The headline read, "Federal investigation expands as more victims come forward." The article mentioned that investigators now had access to comprehensive documentation of allegedly fraudulent business practices spanning nearly a decade. Whoever was orchestrating the attacks on his company had planned this campaign with military precision. They knew exactly which documents would be most damaging, exactly how to time the releases for maximum impact, exactly how to build a legal case that would be impossible to defend against. And they knew him well enough to understand that his greatest weakness wasn't greed or ambition, but the love he'd tried so hard to deny. Someone was systematically destroying his empire while he was consumed with thoughts of 3 children who might be his sons, and a woman who might still be the only person who'd ever truly understood him. Steve walked to the window, looking out at the city where Carla was presumably at home with her boys, their boys, living the life he'd been too frightened to embrace when it had been offered to him. She was creating art that transformed pain into beauty, raising children who might carry his genes but definitely carried her values, building something meaningful from materials that most people would consider insufficient. For the first time in his life, Steve Griggs envied someone else's success. Not their money or their reputation, but their ability to love without conditions, to create without calculation, to be vulnerable enough to build something real. The question now was whether he had enough time left, before his empire completely collapsed, before federal investigators destroyed his freedom, before his own sins consumed everything he'd built, to tell the truth to the only people who might still matter. If Damien, Phoenix, and River were his sons, they deserved to know their father. Not the corporate titan who'd built an empire on stolen dreams, but the man who'd been unconsciously supporting their family for 3 years because he couldn't bear to let go of their mother. And Carla deserved to know that her mysterious benefactor hadn't been a stranger recognizing her talent, but a man who'd never stopped loving her, even when he'd been too proud and frightened to admit it to himself. Chapter 7. When Worlds Collide. Fate, Steve had learned, was just another word for the courage to show up when everything inside you screams to run away. The Grind Coffee House occupied a Mission District corner, like a refuge from San Francisco's relentless ambition. Unlike sterile corporate chains dominating the financial district, this place felt lived in, authentic, with mismatched furniture and local art covering brick walls that had witnessed decades of conversations between dreamers and revolutionaries. Steve sat at a corner table, hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, watching the door with the intensity of someone whose entire future hung on a single moment. He'd spent 3 days orchestrating this chance encounter with the precision he usually reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. His private investigator had provided Carla's schedule. She came here every Tuesday afternoon after her boys' school ended, using the hour before they joined her to work on gallery correspondence and sketch in the notebook she carried everywhere. Steve had verified the pattern himself, driving past twice the previous week like a teenager with an unrequited crush. The irony wasn't lost on him that after building an empire on calculated manipulation, he was now using those same skills to engineer a conversation with the woman he'd never stopped loving. But desperation had stripped away the luxury of moral complexity. His company was hemorrhaging money and reputation with each new lawsuit. Federal investigators were building a case that could destroy his freedom, and somewhere in this city, 3 children who might be his sons were growing up without knowing their father existed. Carla entered at exactly 3:47 p.m., dark hair pulled back to emphasize the elegant line of her neck. She wore jeans and a simple sweater that probably cost less than Steve's socks, but moved with unconscious grace that had first caught his attention years ago in a gallery where she'd hung paintings with the reverent care of someone handling sacred objects. She didn't notice him immediately, focused on ordering her usual medium cappuccino with an extra shot, no sugar, and finding her preferred table near the window where afternoon light would be perfect for drawing. Steve watched her settle into routine, pulling out the same worn notebook, the same collection of pencils arranged with artistic precision. For a moment he imagined what it would be like to walk over, to sit across from her, to have the right to share these quiet moments she probably treasured as her only solitude. Instead, he waited until she was fully absorbed in her sketching before standing and walking to the counter, timing his order to coincide with her next glance around the cafe. Their eyes met across the small space, and Steve saw the exact moment when recognition hit her. A subtle widening of her eyes, a slight straightening of her spine, the careful mask of polite neutrality sliding into place. Carla? Steve approached her table with what he hoped looked like casual surprise rather than calculated stalking. What a coincidence. Steve? Her voice was carefully modulated, professional, giving nothing away. She didn't invite him to sit, but she didn't ask him to leave either. A diplomatic neutrality that spoke of someone who'd learned to navigate dangerous situations without creating unnecessary conflict. May I? Steve gestured to the empty chair across from her, already knowing that refusing would draw more attention than accepting. This was a public place, neutral territory where social conventions provided a buffer against the history that stretched between them like a minefield. Carla nodded once, closing her notebook and setting down her pencil with movements that were carefully controlled. I wouldn't have expected to find you in this part of the city. I needed to get away from the corporate bubble, Steve said, settling into the chair that put him close enough to catch the faint scent of her perfume. Something warm and mysterious that brought back memories of tangled sheets and whispered promises. Sometimes you need perspective that can't be found in boardrooms. Perspective on what? Carla's question carried just enough edge to remind him that she'd seen the news reports about his company's troubles, the lawsuits and investigations that were becoming impossible to ignore. Steve studied her face, looking for traces of the woman who'd once painted him in colors that didn't exist, who'd seen beauty in his code and poetry in his algorithms. On what matters, on what's worth building versus what's worth preserving. He paused, choosing his words carefully, on the difference between success and achievement. Carla's laugh was soft but contained no warmth. That's a lesson that usually comes with a price tag most people can't afford. You're fortunate to be learning it while you still have options. The comment was pointed enough to draw blood, but delivered with such elegant restraint that Steve couldn't even pretend to take offense. This was the woman who'd walked away from him at the charity gala with her dignity intact despite his calculated cruelty, who turned his attempt to humiliate her into a moment that revealed his own character flaws to everyone watching. "I've been thinking about our conversation at the gala," Steve said. "About the things I said, about the person I became in that moment." "Have you?" Carla's voice remained neutral, but Steve caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Not forgiveness, not even interest, but perhaps the faintest recognition that he was attempting something that might be an apology. "I was." Steve struggled with words that felt foreign in his mouth. Apologies weren't currency he'd dealt in for years. Vulnerability wasn't a language his world recognized. "I was afraid." Of what? Of you. Of what you represented. Of the way you made me feel like the money and the success were just costumes I was wearing instead of who I actually was. The admission hung between them like something fragile that might shatter if examined too closely. Around them, the cafe continued its afternoon rhythm, students typing on laptops, artists sketching in corners, conversations flowing in multiple languages that created a backdrop of urban diversity that Steve's rarefied world rarely exposed him to. "Steve," Carla said finally, her voice gentle but firm, "I didn't ask you to choose between success and authenticity. I never demanded that you give up your ambitions or change who you were. I just wanted to be part of your real life, not some secret you kept hidden from the people who mattered to your career." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. She was right. She'd never asked him to choose between love and ambition. That impossible choice had been his own creation, born from fears he'd been too proud to acknowledge and insecurities he'd been too ashamed to address. "I know," Steve said. "I know that now. But 3 years ago, I couldn't see past my own terror of being vulnerable enough to let someone matter that much. And now?" Carla's question was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of 3 years' worth of suppressed hope and carefully guarded dreams. Steve opened his mouth to answer, to say something that might bridge the chasm he'd created between them, when the cafe door opened with a burst of energy and laughter. 3 boys tumbled through the entrance like a small hurricane, their school backpacks sliding off shoulders as they scanned the cafe for their mother. "Mom!" The tallest of the 3, Damien, Steve's research had told him, spotted Carla immediately and began navigating through the tables with the confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. Steve's breath caught as the boys approached, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that threatened to crack bone. Seeing them in photographs was one thing, but watching them move through space, hearing their voices, observing the way they interacted with each other and their environment, was something else entirely. They were beautiful children. That much was immediately obvious. But more than that, they carried themselves with an unconscious intelligence that reminded Steve painfully of his own childhood, when teachers had called him gifted and exceptional in ways that had made him feel isolated rather than special. Who's this? Phoenix, the middle child whose emotional intelligence Steve's investigator had noted, studied Steve with the intensity of someone conducting a psychological evaluation. "This is Mr. Griggs," Carla said carefully. "An old acquaintance." River tilted his head with natural curiosity. "You look familiar. Have we seen you before?" Steve's mouth went dry. "I don't think so, though I have a public profile, so you might have seen my picture." "No," River interrupted with childhood certainty. "It's different. It's like—" He studied Steve's face with artistic concentration. "Like looking at us, but older." The silence that followed was profound. Carla's face paled, her hands gripping her coffee cup tightly. Steve felt the world shift as he looked at three faces that suddenly seemed like echoes of his own childhood photographs. Damien stepped closer, his young face serious. "Mr. Griggs, do you have any children?" The question pierced Steve's chest. He looked at Carla, whose eyes held a warning he couldn't decipher, then back at three boys watching him with scientific intensity. "No," Steve said finally, the word feeling false. "I don't have any children." Phoenix and River exchanged one of their wordless communications. Damien nodded as if Steve's answer confirmed something he'd suspected. "That's sad," Damien said with simple honesty. "I think you'd be a good dad. You have kind eyes when you're not trying to look important." Steve's composure cracked completely. Here was a child, possibly his child, offering him acceptance and understanding that he'd never deserved, seeing potential for goodness that Steve had spent years trying to bury under corporate ruthlessness. "Boys," Carla's voice was steady, but Steve could hear the undercurrent of panic. "Why don't you order your snacks and find a table? I'll be over in a few minutes." They obeyed without argument, but Steve caught the look that passed between them, the recognition that something important was happening between the adults, something that would affect their world in ways they couldn't yet understand. When they were out of earshot, Carla turned back to Steve with eyes that held 3 years' worth of carefully guarded secrets. "You need to leave. Now." "Carla, no." Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "You don't get to show up in their lives like this. You don't get to engineer chance meetings and ask questions about children and family when you made your choice 3 years ago." "What if I made the wrong choice?" Steve's voice was barely a whisper. "What if everything I've built since then has been an attempt to prove to myself that I didn't lose the most important thing in my life?" Carla stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through emotions too complex for Steve to read. Finally, she stood up, gathering her things with the efficient movements of someone who'd learned to make quick exits when situations became untenable. "Steve," she said, her voice soft but final, "some choices can't be unmade. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. You made your decision when you chose your reputation over our relationship. Don't ask me to pay the price for your regrets." She walked away without looking back, joining her boys at their table where they immediately surrounded her with the protective instincts of children who'd learned to shield their mother from the world's cruelty. Steve watched them through the cafe window as they walked down the street. 3 extraordinary children whose genetics might trace back to him, but whose values came entirely from the woman who'd raised them alone. For the first time in his adult life, Steve Griggs understood what it meant to lose everything that actually mattered while gaining everything the world said should make him happy. He'd built an empire, but he'd lost a family. He'd achieved success, but he'd sacrificed the chance to be the man those three boys might have called father. And now, as federal investigators closed in on his corporate crimes, and the woman he loved walked away from him once again, Steve realized that some victories were indistinguishable from defeat. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. Rock bottom, Steve discovered, was the most solid foundation he'd ever stood on, even if it took losing everything to realize it. Rain fell on San Francisco like tears from a sky that had finally given up pretending everything was fine. Steve stood in what had been Griggs Tower's lobby until 3 hours ago, watching security guards escort the last employees out with boxes containing the remnants of careers that had become collateral damage in his spectacular fall. The federal seizure order had been executed with surgical precision, agents arriving simultaneously at all 5 major facilities, armed with warrants suggesting someone had provided investigators with a roadmap to his entire criminal enterprise. 47 floors of his legacy, reduced to evidence in a federal case that would likely result in decades of prison time. $800 million in personal wealth, frozen pending the outcome of investigations that had already found enough evidence to convict him multiple times over. 40,000 employees, suddenly unemployed because their CEO had built an empire on stolen dreams and systematic fraud. Mr. Griggs. The voice belonged to Agent Sarah Chen, the FBI investigator who'd been leading the case against him. She approached with the cautious respect of someone who understood that even fallen kings could still be dangerous. "We need to discuss your surrender. Your attorney says you're prepared to cooperate fully with our investigation." Steve nodded, unable to find words for the magnitude of what he was about to lose. Cooperation meant admitting to crimes that would destroy not just his freedom, but any chance of ever being the man he'd glimpsed during those few moments with Carla and her sons at the coffee shop. It meant accepting that the empire he'd built as his father's legacy was actually a monument to everything his father would have despised. "There's something else," Agent Chen continued, her voice gentler than Steve expected. "Someone's been providing us with documentation for over a year. Comprehensive evidence of systematic intellectual property theft, corporate fraud, and conspiracy to defraud inventors. Your anonymous source has been remarkably thorough." Steve closed his eyes, feeling the last piece of the puzzle click into place. Someone with intimate knowledge of his business practices had been systematically dismantling his empire, while he'd been obsessing over coffee shop encounters and DNA tests. Someone who'd known exactly which documents would be most damaging, exactly how to time the revelations for maximum impact. Someone who'd had access to his private office for months. "Agent Chen," Steve said, his voice hoarse with realization. "I need to ask you something. The person providing you with evidence, did they have access to documents from my personal files, things that would have required physical presence in my office?" Agent Chen's expression didn't change, but Steve caught the slight hesitation that confirmed his suspicion. "I can't discuss the specifics of our source, Mr. Griggs, but I can tell you that someone with a very personal understanding of your operation has been ensuring that justice is served. Personal understanding, physical access, knowledge of not just his business practices, but his psychological vulnerabilities." Steve thought about the photograph of Carla he'd kept on his bulletin board, displayed among the evidence of his crimes, like a trophy or a confession. He thought about the cleaning staff who moved through his building like ghosts, invisible to the executives who never bothered to learn their names. He thought about a woman who'd worked 3 jobs to support her family, who'd had every reason to hate him after his public humiliation, who'd been smart enough to recognize the evidence he'd carelessly displayed and brave enough to act on it. "I need to go somewhere," Steve said suddenly. "Before I surrender, before this becomes official, I need to have one conversation." Agent Chen studied his face with the analytical gaze of someone trained to read deception and desperation. "Mr. Griggs, you're not under arrest yet, but that could change quickly if you try to—" "I'm not running," Steve interrupted. "I just need to apologize to someone who deserves to know the truth before she reads about it in tomorrow's headlines." 2 hours later, Steve stood outside Carla's apartment building in the Mission District, rain soaking through his $1,000 suit to reach skin that felt colder than the weather could account for. The building was nothing like the towers he was accustomed to, 4 stories of weathered brick and fire escapes that spoke of families making do with what they could afford rather than what they could buy. He climbed 3 flights of stairs that creaked under his weight, each step taking him further from the world he'd built and closer to the life he'd abandoned. The hallway smelled of cooking spices and children's laughter, of real lives being lived in small spaces filled with love instead of luxury. Carla answered the door after his third knock, her face cycling through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been concern when she saw his disheveled state. Behind her, Steve could hear the boys' voices, homework discussions that sounded more like graduate seminars, their intelligence evident even in casual conversation. "Steve." Her voice was carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" "My company was seized by federal agents this morning," Steve said without preamble. "I'll be formally arrested within the next 24 hours. I came to tell you that you were right about everything." Carla stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind her to shield her children from whatever was about to unfold. In the fluorescent light of the corridor, Steve could see exhaustion in her face, but also a kind of peace that he'd never achieved despite all his success. "Steve, I don't understand what you're—" "It was you," Steve said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're the one who's been providing evidence to the FBI. You found the documents in my office, photographed them during your cleaning shifts, and spent months building a case that would destroy everything I built on stolen foundations." Carla's expression didn't change, but Steve saw the truth in her eyes, not guilt or shame, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd seen justice served after years of watching people suffer in silence. "Those inventors deserved better," she said simply. "Marcus Chen, Elena Rodriguez, David Kim. They created beautiful things that you took and claimed as your own. They trusted you, and you destroyed their lives for profit." "I know." Steve leaned against the wall, feeling older than his 32 years. "I know what I did to them. I know what I did to you. I know what I've been doing to myself for 3 years, trying to convince myself that building an empire on stolen dreams was somehow noble because it created jobs and wealth." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 3 years' worth of unspoken truths and carefully buried emotions. Finally, Carla spoke with a voice that carried no anger, only sadness for what might have been. "Why did you come here, Steve? What do you want me to say?" "I want ... Steve struggled with words that felt inadequate for the magnitude of what he needed to express. "I want you to know that losing you was the worst mistake of my life. That every day since you walked away, I've been trying to prove to myself that I didn't need what we had. But I did need it. I needed you. I needed the man I was when I was with you." Tears were falling down his face now, mixing with the rain that had followed him up 3 flights of stairs. "I want you to know that I've been buying your paintings for 3 years through shell companies because I couldn't bear to let go of the beauty you create. That the mysterious benefactor who's been supporting your art was just a man who never stopped loving you, even when he was too proud to admit it." Carla's composure finally cracked. "Steve, and I want you to know that if those boys are my sons, if Damien and Phoenix and River carry my genetics along with your values, then they're the best thing I've ever had a part in creating, even if I never get to know them, Even if they never know my name, they're already more successful than anything I've built because they have you as their mother." The words hung between them like a bridge across the chasm Steve had created with his pride and fear. For a moment, neither of them spoke, both processing the magnitude of what had just been confessed. "They are," Carla whispered, so softly Steve almost missed it. "What?" "They are your sons." Carla's voice was steady now, filled with the quiet strength that had carried her through 3 years of raising exceptional children alone. "I was pregnant when you got engaged to someone else. I was planning to tell you, but then I realized you'd made your choice about what kind of life you wanted, and it didn't include the complications of an unexpected family." Steve felt his knees go weak. 3 sons. 3 brilliant, beautiful boys who carried his DNA but had been shaped entirely by Carla's love and strength. Children who might have called him father if he'd been brave enough to choose love over reputation. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out as a plea rather than an accusation. "Because I knew you," Carla said with painful honesty. "I knew you would have done the right thing, married me out of obligation, provided financial support, maybe even tried to love us. But I also knew that you would have resented the choice eventually, and I couldn't let my children grow up feeling like burdens that had derailed their father's dreams." Steve wanted to argue, to insist that he would have chosen them willingly, but the truth was more complex. 3 years ago, he might have done exactly what Carla predicted, fulfilled his obligations while secretly mourning the life he thought he'd lost. "Can I?" Steve's voice broke. "Can I meet them? Really meet them, as their father?" Carla studied his face for a long moment, looking past the corporate executive who'd built an empire on stolen dreams to the man who'd once helped her hang paintings in a tiny studio, who'd brought her coffee at 3 a.m. during creative sessions, who'd seen beauty in her code and poetry in her algorithms. "Steve," she said gently, "tomorrow you'll be in federal custody. In 6 months, you'll probably be in prison. My boys have had 8 years to build a life without a father. I won't let them get attached to someone who's about to disappear again." The truth was devastating but undeniable. Steve had spent so long building walls to protect himself from vulnerability that he'd created a fortress even his own children couldn't enter. "But," Carla continued, her voice softening slightly, "if you're serious about wanting to be part of their lives, about becoming the man you should have been all along, then maybe someday, when you've served your time, when you've made real amends for what you've done, maybe then we can discuss what family means." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was hope. It wasn't a second chance, but it was the possibility of earning one. For the first time in his adult life, Steve Griggs had something worth working toward that couldn't be measured in dollars or market share. As he walked back down 3 flights of creaky stairs, Steve felt lighter than he had in years. Tomorrow would bring federal custody, trials, prison, the systematic dismantling of everything he'd built on stolen foundations. But tonight, he knew that somewhere in a small apartment in the Mission District, 3 exceptional boys were doing homework and laughing with their mother, carrying his genetics, but her values, representing the best possible future he could have helped create. The rain had stopped, and for the first time in 3 years, Steve Griggs could see the stars. Chapter 9. Blood and Truth. Truth, Steve learned, was the only currency that retained its value after everything else had been stripped away. The federal holding facility in downtown San Francisco possessed all the warmth and charm of a concrete tomb, its fluorescent lights casting everything in shades of institutional despair. Steve sat across from his attorney in a room designed to strip away dignity along with freedom, wearing an orange jumpsuit that reduced him from tech mogul to federal prisoner, number 47,291. 3 weeks had passed since his arrest. 3 weeks of headlines chronicling the systematic dismantling of everything he'd built. 3 weeks of coming to terms with the magnitude of what he'd lost and what he'd never actually possessed. The DNA test results lay on the metal table between them like a judgment that would determine the rest of his life. His attorney, Margaret Sinclair, had argued against requesting the tests, pointing out that establishing paternity while facing decades in federal prison served no practical purpose. But Steve had insisted, needing to know with scientific certainty what his heart had already accepted as truth. "The results are conclusive," Margaret said, her voice carrying the professional neutrality of someone who delivered life-changing news to clients who were already drowning in catastrophe. "Damien, Phoenix, and River Choi are your biological children. The probability of paternity is 99.97%. Steve closed his eyes, feeling the last of his carefully constructed defenses crumble. For 3 weeks, he'd held on to the slim possibility that his suspicions were wrong, that the resemblance he'd seen was coincidence, that somewhere in this disaster he could find a piece of his old life that remained unchanged. Now, staring at irrefutable scientific proof, he had to confront the reality that he'd spent 3 years as a father who didn't know his children existed. "I need to see them," Steve said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I need to see Carla. There are things they need to know before the trial starts." Margaret frowned, flipping through her legal pad with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to manage impossible situations. "Steve, visitation requests have to be approved by the court, and given the nature of the charges against you." "They're my children," Steve interrupted, the words carrying a weight that surprised him. "Whatever I've done, whatever I'm going to prison for, they're my sons, and they deserve to know their father before the media turns me into nothing but a cautionary tale about corporate greed." The conversation that followed involved legal complexities that Steve barely understood: supervised visitation, court approval, background checks for family members who wanted to visit federal prisoners. But Margaret, despite her reservations about the wisdom of the request, began the process of arranging what might be the only chance Steve would have to meet his children as their father rather than as a stranger who'd manipulated his way into their lives. 4 days later, Steve sat in the visitation room of the federal facility, his hands shaking as he waited for the family he'd never known he had. The room was designed to strip away privacy while maintaining the illusion of intimacy: metal tables bolted to the floor, plastic chairs that had witnessed thousands of conversations between prisoners and the people who still loved them despite their crimes. When the door opened, Steve's breath caught in his throat. Carla entered first, wearing a simple black dress that emphasized her dignity despite the circumstances. Behind her came Damien, Phoenix, and River, their faces serious with the gravity of children who'd been told that today they would meet their father for the first time. They settled across from him at the designated table, a federal marshal positioned discreetly nearby to ensure that nothing inappropriate transpired. For a moment, nobody spoke, all 4 members of his family studying Steve with the intensity of scientists examining a specimen that might be dangerous or might be harmless. "Boys," Carla said finally, her voice gentle but firm, "this is Steve Griggs. He's your biological father." The silence that followed was profound. Steve had imagined this moment countless times during his 3 weeks in custody, but none of his fantasies had prepared him for the reality of looking into faces that mirrored his own while knowing that these children had grown up without him by choice rather than circumstance. Damien, the natural leader of the trio, spoke first. "Mom told us that our father was someone who loved us, but couldn't be with us. She said that sometimes adults make choices that hurt the people they care about most." Steve felt tears beginning to blur his vision. Even at 8 years old, his eldest son was displaying the kind of emotional intelligence that Steve had never developed: the ability to understand complex human motivations without judgment or anger. "That's true," Steve said, his voice barely steady. "I made choices that hurt your mother, and those choices meant I missed the chance to know you were even born." I can't change that, but I wanted to meet you before—" he gestured around the visitation room, "before my life becomes very different." Phoenix leaned forward, studying Steve's face with the analytical intensity that had made his teachers describe him as exceptional. "Are you sorry for what you did? Not just sorry you got caught, but actually sorry that you hurt people?" The question was more sophisticated than most adults would have asked, and it deserved an honest answer. Steve looked at this middle child who could read emotions like code, who saw through facades with the clarity of someone who'd learned early that adults weren't always truthful. "Yes," Steve said, "I'm sorry that I built my success by stealing other people's ideas. I'm sorry that I hurt innocent people who trusted me. I'm sorry that I was too proud and scared to choose love when it was offered to me. And I'm sorry that my cowardice cost you three the chance to have a father who could have been there for your first words, your first steps, your first days of school." River, the youngest and most artistic of the trio, tilted his head with the curiosity that made him see the world in patterns others missed. "Do you know anything about us? About who we are, what we like, what we're good at?" Steve's heart broke a little more. These children were asking him to prove that he cared about them as individuals rather than as genetic extensions of himself. They wanted to know if he saw them as people worth knowing rather than as obligations to be managed. "I know that Damien tests in the 99th percentile for spatial reasoning and logical analysis," Steve said carefully. "I know that Phoenix can read people better than most psychologists. I know that River sees the world in equations and poetry, that he solves calculus problems and then writes haikus about the solutions." The boys exchanged one of their wordless communications, some form of triplet telepathy that spoke of bonds forged through years of protecting each other and their mother. Finally, Damien nodded as if some internal debate had been resolved. "We know about your company," Damien said with the directness of childhood. "We know you stole ideas from people who trusted you, but we also know that you've been buying Mom's paintings for 3 years, even after you were mean to her at that fancy party." Steve's surprise must have shown on his face, because Phoenix continued the explanation. "We're good with computers. Really good. We traced the shell companies back to your main accounts. We figured out that our mysterious benefactor was actually our father." "But we didn't tell Mom," River added quickly. "We wanted her to have the money, and we knew she'd give it back if she found out it came from you." Steve looked at Carla, who was hearing this information for the first time. Her face showed a mixture of pride in her son's intelligence and shock at their deception, even if it had been motivated by love. "You've been protecting me," Carla said to her boys, her voice full of wonder. "Even from yourselves." "We protect each other," Damien said, simply. "That's what families do." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Steve had ever experienced. For 90 minutes he learned about his sons not as genetic specimens or intellectual curiosities, but as complex human beings with dreams, fears, and favorite books that they shared with the generosity of children who decided he was worth including in their world. Damien wanted to design buildings that could withstand earthquakes and help communities recover from disasters. Phoenix was fascinated by how technology could help people understand themselves better. River wrote poetry and had been accepted into a special program for mathematically gifted children who also showed exceptional creative abilities. They'd spent years wondering about their father, creating stories about who he might be and why he couldn't be with them. Some stories cast him as a secret agent protecting them from a distance, others as an explorer trapped somewhere far away, still others as someone who'd died heroically. "The truth is sadder than our stories," River said with matter-of-fact wisdom. "But it's also more hopeful because you're still here and you can still change." As their visitation time came to an end, Steve realized that these 90 minutes had been more meaningful than most of the relationships he'd built during his adult life. His sons, Their intelligence, their empathy, their ability to see potential for redemption in someone who'd caused significant harm, represented everything he should have been working toward instead of the empire he'd built on stolen foundations. "Will we see you again?" Phoenix asked as they prepared to leave. Steve looked at Carla, seeing in her eyes the same question her son had voiced. The answer depended on factors beyond their control: sentencing guidelines, parole possibilities, the chance that he might survive federal prison with enough of his humanity intact to deserve a relationship with these extraordinary children. "I hope so," Steve said honestly. "I hope that someday, when I've served my time and made amends for what I've done, I can earn the right to be part of your lives. Not because I'm your biological father, but because I've become someone worthy of being your dad." Damien stood up, walked around the table, and hugged Steve with the unself-conscious affection of a child who'd decided that love was more important than perfection. Phoenix and River followed, creating a moment of connection that transcended the institutional setting and the circumstances that had brought them together. "We'll wait for you," Damien whispered into Steve's ear, "but you have to promise to become the father we deserve." As they walked away, escorted back to their life in the outside world, while Steve returned to his cell, he carried with him the weight and wonder of being a father. Not just biologically, but emotionally. Not just in theory, but in practice. For the first time in his life, Steve Griggs had something worth fighting for that couldn't be measured in dollars or market share. He had 3 sons who believed he could become better than he'd ever been, and a woman who'd loved him enough to protect their children from his worst impulses, while somehow preserving the possibility that he might still become the man she'd once seen in him. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was hope. And for someone facing decades in federal prison, hope was the most valuable currency he could imagine. Chapter 10. Love in the Ruins. Sometimes the most beautiful structures are built from the rubble of what came before, if you're brave enough to start over with cleaner hands. 6 months had passed since Steve's sentencing hearing, 6 months since federal judge Patricia Hernandez had looked down from her bench and delivered 24 years for corporate fraud, intellectual property theft, and conspiracy. The sentence would have been longer without his complete cooperation with investigators and his efforts to help recover stolen assets for victims. The Federal Correctional Institution in Lompoc wasn't the country club prison media outlets often associated with white-collar criminals. It was a genuine penitentiary where Steve's days were measured in concrete blocks, institutional meals, and the gradual reconstruction of his understanding of what success actually meant. The letter from Carla had arrived on a Tuesday morning that looked identical to every other morning in his new world, but its contents had fundamentally altered Steve's perception of time and possibility. Her handwriting, still elegant, still carrying traces of the artist who saw beauty in simple things, covered 3 pages of carefully chosen words that had taken her weeks to write and him hours to fully process. "Steve," the letter began, "the boys ask about you constantly, not just because you're their biological father, but because something in that conversation convinced them you're worth believing in." Steve had read those lines repeatedly, memorizing each curve of her letters, each pause suggesting she'd set down her pen to consider whether honesty was worth the risk. The victim compensation fund had cost him everything: his remaining assets, his houses, his art collection. But watching former victims like Marcus Chen and Elena Rodriguez receive settlements that would allow them to restart their careers had given Steve something money never provided: peace. The letter continued with updates about their sons. Damien had been accepted into a special mathematics program at UC Berkeley, taking college-level courses while finishing high school. Phoenix had started helping elderly people learn technology, displaying the same emotional intelligence that had seen through Steve's defenses during their first meeting. River had won a national poetry contest with a piece called Equations of Forgiveness, exploring mathematical principles underlying human redemption. But the final paragraph made Steve's hands shake. "I've been thinking about what you said that night you came to our apartment, about becoming the man you were when you were with me. I can't promise anything, Steve. I can't guarantee that forgiveness is possible or that trust can be rebuilt from such broken foundations. But I'm willing to try if you are. The boys want to know their father, not just visit him. And I want to believe that love can survive even the worst mistakes if both people are committed to building something new from whatever pieces remain." Steve folded the letter carefully, returning it to the envelope that had become his most precious possession in a world where personal belongings were measured in necessity rather than luxury. Through the narrow window of his cell, he could see other inmates in the exercise yard, men who'd made different mistakes but faced similar reckonings with the distance between who they'd been and who they might still become. His cellmate, Marcus Rodriguez, a former accountant serving time for embezzlement who'd become an unlikely friend and mentor, noticed Steve's expression as he put the letter away. "Good news from home?" "Maybe," Steve said, still processing the implications of Carla's words. "My, the mother of my children thinks there might be hope for our family. She's willing to try building something new." Marcus laughed, a sound that carried both cynicism and hope in equal measure. "Brother, in here we learn that willing to try is the most beautiful phrase in the English language. Most people on the outside won't even give you that much." Steve had spent 6 months learning the truth of Marcus's observation. The business world he'd once dominated had moved on without him, treating his disgrace as a cautionary tale rather than a tragedy. Former colleagues avoided mentioning his name, former competitors used his downfall as marketing opportunities, and the technology empire he'd built was systematically dismantled and sold to the highest bidders. But in the strange ecosystem of federal prison, Steve had discovered communities he'd never known existed. Men who'd made catastrophic mistakes, but refused to let those mistakes define the remainder of their lives. Educational programs that taught everything from basic literacy to advanced computer programming. Support groups where corporate executives and street-level drug dealers found common ground in their shared commitment to becoming better than their worst decisions. Steve had thrown himself into these programs with the same intensity he'd once brought to hostile takeovers. He'd earned his GED teaching certificate, helping other inmates master the mathematics and logical reasoning that had once made him successful in technology. He joined the Victim Impact Program, where he'd written letters of apology to every person his crimes had affected and participated in mediated conversations with some of his victims who were willing to engage with him. Most importantly, he'd begun the slow, difficult work of understanding how he'd become someone capable of causing such systematic harm to innocent people. Therapy sessions with Dr. Patricia Williams, the prison psychologist, had excavated layers of fear and insecurity that Steve had buried under decades of achievement and acquisition. The man who'd been terrified of vulnerability had learned to examine his own psychological architecture with the same analytical precision he'd once brought to corporate acquisitions. 3 days after receiving Carla's letter, Steve was called to the visitation room where he'd met his children for the first time. But instead of the sterile, institutional space he'd expected, he found himself being escorted to a different area, the family visitation trailer that allowed for longer, more natural interactions between inmates and their loved ones. Carla was waiting inside the small but comfortable space, wearing a blue dress that reminded Steve of the painting she'd been working on when they'd first met. Her hair was longer now, framing her face in a way that emphasized the strength she'd developed during 3 years of single parenthood and the gradual success of her artistic career. "You look different," she said as he entered, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to guard her expectations. "Healthier, more present." Steve looked down at himself. The standard prison clothing that had replaced his expensive suits, the hands that now showed calluses from working in the prison library and teaching center, the body that had been transformed by institutional food and exercise routines designed for survival rather than aesthetics. Prison has a way of stripping away everything that isn't essential, Steve said, settling into the chair across from her. I've been learning to recognize the difference between who I was trying to appear to be and who I actually am underneath all the performance. They talked for 2 hours, carefully monitored conversation in the institutional visiting room. Carla described her life as a single mother, the challenges and rewards of raising 3 extraordinary boys while building her artistic career. She talked about the decision to provide evidence against him to federal investigators, explaining it hadn't been motivated by revenge, but by desire to see justice for the inventors whose lives he'd destroyed. Steve talked about his daily routine, the education programs he'd joined, the letters he'd written to victims, and the slow process of understanding how his fear of vulnerability had transformed him into someone capable of systematic cruelty. He described therapy sessions where he'd learned to recognize the difference between love and possession, between supporting someone's dreams and trying to control their choices. "The boys want to visit you," Carla said as their time wound down. "Not just once, but regularly. They want to know their father, to build a relationship that isn't defined by the mistakes you made before they were born." "And you?" Steve asked quietly. "What do you want?" Carla was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if looking for traces of the man she'd once loved beneath the person he'd become. "I want to believe that people can change fundamentally, not just temporarily. I want to believe that love can survive even the worst mistakes if both people are committed to building something new rather than trying to reconstruct what was broken." "I can't promise to be perfect," Steve said. "I can't promise that I won't make mistakes or that I've somehow become immune to the fears and insecurities that made me hurt people I loved. But I can promise that I'm committed to becoming someone worthy of your trust and their love." Carla reached across the small table, taking his hand in hers for the first time in 3 years. Her skin was warm, real, carrying the faint scent of paint and possibilities that reminded Steve of everything he'd lost and everything he might still be able to earn back. "Then we'll try," she said simply. "We'll build something new from whatever pieces remain, and we'll see if love really is stronger than fear." As they said goodbye, with a hug that lasted longer than institutional regulations typically allowed but shorter than either of them wanted, Steve felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, hope that wasn't dependent on external achievement or acquisition, but on the simple possibility that broken people could learn to love each other better than they'd ever known how to love before. Walking back to his cell through corridors that no longer felt like punishment, but like preparation, Steve Griggs understood that he was finally building something that might actually last. Not an empire that could be seized by federal agents or a reputation that could be destroyed by headlines, but a family that could survive mistakes and grow stronger through forgiveness. It would take years before he was eligible for parole, years of proving his transformation was genuine rather than convenient. But for the first time in his adult life, Steve had something worth waiting for that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or stock prices. He had 3 sons who believed he could become the father they deserved, and a woman who was willing to bet that love could triumph over fear if both people were brave enough to start over with cleaner hands and more honest hearts. The future, for the first time in years, looked like something worth building.